Well, new fallout now over that open mic comment. President Obama speaking with Russian President Dmitry Medvedev about a disputed American missile shield in Europe. Overheard saying he'll have more flexibility to deal with this issue, which is controversial, especially in Russia, after his election. And it raises the question, what if President Bush had been caught doing that? Joining me now, Dana Perino, former White House press secretary and co-host of The Five right here on FNC, press secretary to President George W. Bush, and Andy Card, former White House chief of staff under President George Bush, and Ed Gillespie, former RNC chair and former counselor to President George W. Bush. So we're so looking forward to this, because who better to ask than you three? And I know I'll start with you, Dana, that it's been like fingernails on a chalkboard for you to watch how the media reacts to President Obama having his open mic comment when President Bush got very different treatment after he had, and let's just play it, the following open mic comment with Russia. Watch President Bush. Stand by. It's coming.
See, the irony is that what they need to do is get Syria to get Hezbollah to stop doing it.
So he dropped an S-bomb, and it was covered very differently.
It certainly was. I was the deputy press secretary on the trip. I remember the press corps went crazy because the president said the S word, and did he know that he was on an open mic? But listen to what he said. He was talking about getting Syria to help us get Hezbollah to stop attacking innocent people. To me, that is very different than whispering sweet nothings into the ear of Dmitry Medvedev on an open mic right after a press session. I can understand why some people think it was intentional. I personally don't. Yesterday, the front page of the New York Times sort of referenced this, but Obama's hot mic moment was on page 14, Washington Post, page 11. When that happened with President Bush, it was everywhere. And you can imagine if it had been another way around, though I think it was President Bush would have been delivering a very different sort of message to Vladimir Putin through Dmitry Medvedev if he'd had a chance.
For President Bush to have been suggesting, you just wait until I get reelected and then things are going to change.
Right.
I'm sure the New York Times would have raised some eyebrows at that. Andy, I want to ask you about something that's been rather controversial in some circles, but the question is whether it would have been a lot more controversial if your former boss had done it. This administration has said it's okay to kill American terrorists if they deem it proper. Without, a hearing, without a trial. Anwar al-Awlaki got drone striked to death, and our Attorney General said the following in justifying this. Listen to Eric Holder.
Some have argued that the president is required to get permission from a federal court before taking action against a United States citizen who is a senior operational leader of al-Qaeda or associated forces. This is simply not accurate.
Then they refused to make public the legal justification for that decision. Can you imagine if John Ashcroft had done that?
Well, quite frankly, there are a lot of decisions that the president is making right now that are inconsistent with what he would have challenged President Bush to do when he was in the United States Senate. So I think there's a big difference between being a president and a senator. I'm actually sympathetic to a president using all of the authority under Article 2 of the Constitution. But President Obama has not done a good job of living up to the expectations of the people who were to my left. He has, I think, recognized that the role of president is pretty tough, and he's got to make some tough decisions, and I support a strong Article 2 interpretation.
Of course you do. I mean, I'm sure you're behind that decision by Attorney General Eric Holder, but the question is, would the New York Times, would the left, the far left, have been making a bigger deal about this if it was your guy who said that, if it was Ashcroft, or if it was Gonzalez, or if it was Mukasey who said that instead of Mr. Holder?
There's not a doubt that there's a double standard. The left-leaning media has given President Obama a bye where they didn't give President Bush any slack. And I just think it's outrageous, but I do want a strong president. I want the president to keep his oath of office and to live up to the responsibility that he has. I also want the media to recognize that being president is a tough job, and I don't think that the second guessing that went on when Senator Obama was senator rather than president would have been masked the way that the criticisms are masked today.
Ed, what do you make of things like, we talked on this program a few times about the Koch brothers and how this administration has really gone after these big Republican donors. They're private citizens who employ tens of thousands of Americans, but the Obama re-election campaign has really targeted them. If President Bush had done the same to George Soros or some other big left-leaning donors, what do you think the folks would have said about it?
Oh, there would have been outrage, and the fact that someone in the White House actually put out confidential tax information from the Koch companies, how did they get it? There would be, the New York Times would be having FOIA requests and wanting to know, how did the White House come across confidential tax information, then why did they make it public? You hardly even hear anything about this story. And, Megyn, on the story about the open mic, what's interesting is we saw the contrast in terms of the coverage relative to President Bush. Now, Dana rightly pointed out the placement of this story, but also note the context of the story. The context of the story is Republicans jump on President Obama's comments. So it's a process story about Republicans, playing politics as opposed to the substance of what the president said, which is pretty striking.
Dana, why? Why is it this way? Because we have a left-leaning mainstream media?
I struggle with this because it's hard to explain, especially if you expect fairness and you grow up in a family that demanded fairness. It treated everybody fairly. But one of the great things that I learned from President Bush and also from Andy Card and Ed Gillespie, who helped guide me during those times when I was press secretary, is that as a conservative, as a Republican, you have to try so much harder. And you have to expect that the stories are going to be that it's not going to be fair. Do you remember, Megyn, when President Bush was in China and he tried to go out of the room and the door was locked?
Yeah.
Okay. The next day, on the front page of the New York Times, there were 5 photographs above the fold of the different moments, of the freeze frames of those moments. President Obama has had a few doozies, like Navy corpsman and speaking Austrian when there's no Austrian language, it's German. And the media just lets it go. And I actually don't understand it. I don't know whether they think that they're being fair and that they just don't recognize it.
Does it gall you, Andy, when you watch things like that, like the different coverage of the gaffes or even of the Gulf? That's been an issue that some have raised, that President Obama's been out on the links. I don't know what the statistic is, something like 90 times, right,
90
since assuming the presidency.
And
whereas President Bush gave up
as
golf,
much as George Bush.
because saying he didn't feel right doing it when we were in the midst of war. Does it gall you to see that double standard?
It does gall me to see the double standard. And the double standard is there, and it's not deniable. They are practicing a double standard. But I'm also troubled by President Obama's statement to the president of Russia, because it appears that he's planning to do things that he doesn't want to talk about with the American people. And the American people deserve to be part of the policy debate that the president's going to present during his re-election campaign. And if he's saying, don't worry, I'll be very different after I get a second term than I appear to the public while I'm trying to earn that second term. And I don't think that was a good response for him at all. And I think that it was kind of cheating us of the democracy that we're expecting from our president.
What do you make, what are your recollections in terms of how, because President Bush took a lot of incoming, and Dana has talked to me about this privately as well. He took a lot of incoming. Did he have to have a thick skin for what he faced? Does any president, and does this president?
President Bush did have a thick skin, and he, will leave it to history to judge his presidency. I think it'll be judged very well for his accomplishments. But from what I understand, President Obama has a very thin skin, and if you, talk to reporters in the media, the way they're treated by this White House, that's another thing that never would have happened in the Bush White House. Then the media never would have stood for the kind of treatment they get, frankly. I mean, they stood strong for themselves and for their, their fourth estate status, and, they're curled up like little puppy dogs at the feet of this White House. It's kind of sad to see in some ways.
Dana, your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think there's been some changes over the years in the press briefing room, where you had a lot of institutional knowledge, and some of the reporters who had covered multiple administrations, they have moved on with the changing media. All I know is that early on, right after we left the White House, Ed and I had this idea to buy a website domain, ifbushhaddonethat.com. And imagine how popular this website would be today. We should have done it, Ed.
We should have.
There's always next
Megyn,
time.
Could I make one other point just real quick?
Sure,
because I do think that, the White House is telegraphing today in a story that if the Supreme Court rules against them on Obamacare, that they're laying the groundwork for an attack on the court, on the Supreme Court, that it's a political court, that it's partisan, that it's not legitimate. Which is really remarkable. It's not surprising, given that President Obama, in a State of the Union, attacked the Supreme Court in the chamber of the legislative branch and lost a just recent court ruling 9-0 over the ministerial exception over his administration's policies. And yet I guarantee you, I'm willing to predict right here, right now, that that will be the storyline. It will not be that the constitutional lawyer, President of the United States, was overturned on his signature legislation by the Supreme Court of the United States. They are laying out a storyline that it is because the Supreme Court has unfortunately become a partisan entity. And they telegraphed it today, and let's just watch to see how the media narrative plays out if that's the way the result comes out.
Well, we'll know the answer to that by
We'll
Monday.
hold them to account,
If Bush had done that, I know what the narrative would be.
What if Bush had done that? All right, so I'll book all of you right now on the air when we have a ruling on health care and we see what the reaction is, one way or the other. Come back.
It was great to be with friends. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.